You need to have your notebook out for notes today. I know we've been doing a lot of activities lately. We're going to take a break from that and go ahead and write some stuff in our notebook so we have it to look back on for studying for the test or for the final or whatever we might need to study for. So evolution is our topic. You can start a brand new section in your notebook for this. And I want you to write down the definition of evolution. So to evolve means to change over time. And we use this in a lot of different ways. We don't just use it with organisms. We can talk about places evolving or things evolving or ideas evolving. We talk about it in a lot of different ways. Okay, but in biology, specifically, it's going to mean that organisms or populations of organisms are changing over time. So evolution is change over time. Now, this picture down here is a little misleading, but remember we talked about humans, right? And we said, well, humans didn't come from apes, even though you might think, oh, this looks like an ape. They came from a common ancestor, right? And that ancestor eventually evolved into apes and evolved into humans, okay? So this is not actually an ape, this is the ancestor of apes and humans, okay? So once upon a time, there was a guy named Lamarck, okay? So back in the day, right, we've talked about Charles Darwin. Well, before Darwin, there was a guy named Lamarck, okay? And don't worry about writing this down. So in the 1800s, Lamarck thought that organisms gained features that they used a lot, and they lost features that they didn't use. So for example, let's say that I used my arm a lot, okay, to reach for stuff. Well, Lamarck thought that your arm would grow and you would get longer arms, and then you would pass that to your offspring. His classic example is with a giraffe. So notice with this giraffe, he has the giraffe, right, and it looks kind of like a horse here. And because it's reaching for the leaves in the trees, over time, the neck is going to get longer and longer because it used it, right? Well, we know that's not true, okay? But back in the day, they didn't really know a whole lot about evolution. And so this was one of the ideas. Now, if we think about it, evolution wasn't a very popular idea back in Darwin's time. The reason it wasn't popular is because there were a lot of religious people. There's a lot of religious people today, but science, okay, wasn't as common. So with religion, a lot of times people said, well, you know, how could there be evolution? God made animals perfect, right, in his image. And if you've ever had a religion course, right, or you've gone to church, you might have talked about Noah's Ark or how the animals came to be and all of that. And so there are a lot of individuals who said, well, we can't have evolution because God made everything how it is and perfect, right? And there's some people who still talk about that today. But we know from science and from those beaks that we've talked about with the finches, we can see organisms change over time. So organisms do change. So Darwin comes in. Darwin proves his theory wrong. Again, you don't need to write any of this yet. And remember what Darwin looked at, okay? So Darwin looked at finches, okay? So let's write this down. Charles Darwin saw that each type of finch on the Galapagos was adapted, we're going to use that word a lot, adapted, to eating a particular type of food, meaning it had traits that allowed it to eat that certain type of food. All right, so we saw some of these different finches, right? We said here are the Galapagos. The Galapagos Islands are off the coast of Ecuador, right? And we looked at the different islands. We said they have different foods on them, and we saw a map kind of looks similar to this. And here's a picture, right, of those different finches, some of them. And some of them ate seeds, some ate buds, some ate insects, lots of different things. So he said that the finches all came from one species and evolved into many new species. And that's what we saw yesterday when we looked at that video and we talked about how those finches evolved. They were separated from each other, and because the environments on the islands were different and had different foods, they evolved into many new species. Okay. All right, so Darwin. Darwin comes on and he writes this book. Don't need to write this down. He developed this theory of evolution by natural selection. So he publishes this great book. It's called On the Origin of Species. And he talks about his theory on how things evolve. And he says things evolve by this idea called natural selection. He came up with this idea. And again, here's a picture of Charles Darwin in his time. He was super young when he boarded that ship and was sailing around the world for 5 years. So what is natural selection? This you absolutely need to write down. So the idea of natural selection. Individuals that are better adapted to their environment or best adapted to their environment survive and reproduce, passing on their genes to future generations. I'll give you a second to write that down. So individuals that are better adapted to their environment survive and reproduce, passing on their genes to future generations. Now we saw this. We saw this a couple different times. We talked about the bacteria, right? We started off with blue bacteria, okay? Over time, some of them, like with Addie's case, developed a mutation, right? And that mutation allowed them to survive the antibiotics. So when the antibiotics came in, killed off most of them, but these guys could survive. And so over time, the population evolves because these guys were best able to survive in their environment with antibiotics. And so they reproduce, they pass on their genes, okay? We saw that with the finches yesterday. Okay, we've got our little birdies. Oh my gosh, I'm not even gonna try to draw a little bird. This is gonna be a terrible bird, guys. Here's my little birdie, okay? So we've got our birds, and they start off with smallish beaks. Well, when there was a drought, okay, all of them with these small beaks end up dying off, okay? So they couldn't find food, so the small beaks end up dying off, right? Big beaks end up surviving, okay, because they're best adapted for that environment and reproducing. So in the end, we get a lot of birds with large beaks. Okay, so this is everything that we've been talking about. So if we think about it, we have some requirements. What are some things that need to happen in order for natural selection to occur? Can we just have any population change and evolve? Well, there's some requirements, okay? Easy way to remember these is VIST, okay? This is the acronym or the letters we're going to remember. So the first is variation. We have to have different individuals because some of them have to be able to better survive than others, okay? So individuals have different traits. We saw this. Some of the bacteria were resistant, some of them were not. Some of the birds had small beaks, some of the birds had big beaks, okay? Variation is the first requirement. If organisms are all the same, some of them can't survive better than others. If they're all clones and they have the same DNA, some of them aren't going to, there's not going to be any difference in how they survive. Now, these traits have to be passed on, inherited. They have to be in the genes, okay? It can't just be like, oh, I'm going to be a bodybuilder, okay? I'm going to get super ripped, and then when I have kids, I'm going to pass on my bodybuilding traits, and my kids will be super ripped. No, well, that's not how it works, okay? We have to, the traits, right, have to be genetic. So things that are determined by your genes. Skin color, eye color, beak size, okay? Whether or not you're resistant to antibiotics. Those are all things in your genes, okay? So it has to be something genetic. It can't just be like, oh, I like candy. I'm going to pass on my like for candy to my kids. Selection. The environment's going to select who survives. How does it select? Well, the environment doesn't have a brain. It's not literally picking who's going to survive and who's not. But what happens here is the individuals that have traits that allow them to survive end up surviving. So that's how the environment kind of selects who will survive. Individuals with certain traits survive and then reproduce. So in the case of antibiotics, right, the environment was, we had antibiotics in this environment. The antibiotics killed off those individuals, okay, that did not have the trait for antibiotic resistance. So the environment selected the resistant ones to survive. The last requirement is time. So over time, we get a change in the population or change in species. So over time, we get more antibacterial resistant bacteria, okay? Or over time, we get larger beaks. So over time, we get a change in species. Now notice, V-I-S-T, VIST. That's how you're going to remember these. These are the 4 requirements for natural selection. So one thing I want to touch on is this idea, we don't need to write this down, but this idea that natural selection is different from evolution. Sure, we might say they're kind of the same thing, but they're not exactly the same, okay? So natural selection is the idea that those that are best adapted survive, okay? You see that down here in this example. Some of these little camel, horse, whatever the heck these things are tall. Some are short, that's variation. The taller ones survive because they can reach the food. Over time, our population ends up having tall individuals. Okay, so natural selection is the idea that these guys survive. Evolution is change over time. So natural selection leads to evolution. Okay, natural selection is in the environment selecting who's going to survive, and over time that leads to change in our population. Okay, so even though we might use them interchangeably, know that they're 2 different ideas. Okay. All right, in this example, let's look at this example of natural selection. Do we have the requirements for natural selection? Variation. Is there variation in the beetles? Are they different? Yes. Some of them are brown, some of them are green. Notice they have DNA inside of them. That's what this is representing, the DNA, right? Some of them have 2 green DNA genes. Some of them have a green DNA and an orange or brown DNA gene. Inheritance. Do you think the color for beetles is inherited? Yeah, probably. Okay, I don't think the beetle went and spray painted himself this color, so it's probably inherited. Selection. Over time, okay, the environment's going to select for which one. Which of these beetles is going to survive? If this bird wants to eat this beetle, these beetles, which are going to survive? The brown ones are going to survive. Why? Because they can blend in. They're camouflage. So the brown ones are going to survive. The green ones are going to die off. Last requirement is time. So over time, what's going to be the most popular color of beetles? Brown. Okay. Last thing we're going to write down. Sometimes you'll hear us talk about the word fitness. And not fitness like let's go to the gym and work out. Fitness as in it relates to evolution. Okay. So we say survival of the fittest, or organisms that are fittest end up surviving. So fitness is the ability to produce offspring that survive, okay? So if we go back to this idea, I'll come back to this definition so you can write it down. If we go back to this idea, which of these beetles has the highest level of fitness then? The brown ones, because they're going to survive and reproduce, right? And pass their genes on. So organisms that have the highest fitness or the fittest are those that are going to survive and then reproduce, okay? There's going to be a question on your worksheet today that says, which of these species or which of these individuals has the highest fitness? Well, it's going to be the one that produces the most offspring, okay, that are able to survive, okay, and reproduce. So here's what you're doing today. You guys are going to be working on a worksheet. Okay? Notice there are QR codes. You can scan these using Snapchat. You just hold your finger over the QR code when you have Snapchat open. So you have your camera, hold your finger over this, it will open up a picture. Now, if you don't want to use a smartphone, I have diagrams, paper diagrams up front you can use. Okay? So you're going to look at these, answer the questions. Then you have peppered moth graph. So you're going to be making a graph. Remember, how do we make a graph? What do we need to remember? We need to remember that we have even increments. Okay? What do I mean by even increments? 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, or 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. We need to label. Okay? Label the left, label the bottom. We should have a title. Okay? So what you're going to be graphing is something over time. What kind of graph did we say you guys should use if we have time on the bottom? Bar graph or line graph? So typically we use a line graph. That's the one where we have dots, right? And we're connecting them. You're going to have one line for one type of moth and another line for another type of moth. Okay? All right. Then you're going to answer some questions. Okay? You're going to look at this little picture to help you with the second part, and then the last is on fitness. Remember what we said about fitness, which survives and makes the most offspring that survive until adulthood. Okay, so when you're done, you can turn this into me, and that is it. I will see you all tomorrow. Have a great day.